Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Columbia Business School Executive Education Executive Webinar Series. Today, we're going to be discussing media in the 21st digital century with Professor Miklos Sarvary. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. There will be a recording of the webinar that will be available after the session, so we'll send out a link to everyone so you can see and review the content for yourself. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box in the Zoom meeting window at the bottom, and we will be taking questions after the content portion of the webinar. And also, we'd love it if you tweet about the webinar using the hashtag CBSExecEd. All right, today we're very excited to welcome Professor Miklos Sarvary, who is the Carson Family Professor of Business and the Faculty Director for the Media Program at Columbia Business School. His research focuses on media and information marketing. Professor Sarvary, great to have you with us.
Thank you for this introduction. Good day, everybody. I'm very excited to be here and talk to you about the future media landscape. We don't have that much time, but hopefully I can get across a couple of interesting thoughts. Feel free to ask questions. I will try to leave a little bit of time for questions towards the end. Now, just to warm up the crowds, I would want to ask you, what does WWW stand for? And I am pretty sure that all of you will say it means the World Wide Web. And you couldn't have been more wrong in that, because actually WWW was the first logo of Radio Corporation of America about 100 years ago. Not quite, but almost 100 years ago. And at the time, it meant Worldwide Wireless. And one of the key messages of these next 20 minutes that I would like to get across is that, like every other industry, media is also changing in terms of discontinuous big revolutions followed by continuous small adjustments. And the last big revolution, arguably we are in a big revolution today with the internet and the digital transformation of media that has really sort of shaken many of the industries. Think about the newspaper industry, for example. But the last such big revolution was about 100 years ago, when the world transitioned from print media to the broadcasting media. And if you think about it, there's probably not a single person on the planet today that can imagine the world without broadcasting. Broadcasting, and in particular, its better known form as television, is the dominant media today, or has been in the last, I'd say, like almost 100 years, maybe not before the Second World War when it was radio, but even radio is a broadcasting technology. So about 100 years ago, there was a huge transition from print to broadcasting. And my argument is that we can learn a lot from this transition to understand what is the likely outcome of today's transition from analog to digital media, and what is going to be the internet medium like in the future. But of course, one of the main things is that this revolution, one of the main messages is that this revolution is pretty much over. Revolutions of industries, last about 2.5 decades. If you think about the internet, it has started at the beginning of the 90s. And by now, we are pretty much, the dust is settling down. So with all the innovation that has happened in the last 2 decades, we kind of like gotten used to the fact that there is always some new things coming out. And my argument is that we probably will have to change our minds and get used to a world where there's not that much change happening anymore. Or even if there is a lot of change happening, it's not going to affect the mainstream. So it is really a good time to ask ourselves, what is the result of this revolution, and what is going to be media looking like in the next, say, 50 years. Now, when I look at this logo, when I said that we can go back to history and look at and try to find some analogies, I'm always thinking about the US. And the key reason why I'm thinking about the US is that the broadcasting revolution, the only place in the world where that industry revolution was decentralized and was driven by markets rather than governments was the United States. In all other countries, the beginning of the last century, broadcasting was brought to the general public by the government. Now, obviously, the internet, that is a global new medium, is very much responding to market forces, and governments have a real hard time actually regulating it. Of course, regulation is a big issue, but there needs to, because it's a global thing, governments have a harder time to sort of coordinate their regulation around that. So there is really a lot of lessons. Now, I don't want to go through the analogies between the internet revolution and the broadcasting revolution. There are many of them, okay? And I have listed them here. We could talk for about half an hour on each of these topics. The fact that there was a paradigm shift in consumption, that it took quite a long time for people to understand that the broadcasting medium is not like the print medium, that you can reach a really huge number of people at the same instance. And like politics had to adapt to that. And similarly, like politics and our social life or business life even is kind of adapting to the fact that now we don't have a broadcasting environment, but we have an interactive environment. And businesses have to completely rethink how they are organized, how they interface with consumers, how they design their business processes to be able to take advantage of this interactivity. And it takes quite a long time. If you think about how advertising looked like, digital advertising looked like even 10 years ago, and how does it look now, you can sort of like appreciate the difference of how long it took for advertisers to understand what interactivity means really in the space of, in the area of advertising. Another important analogy is the role of outsiders, both in the case of the last century and in today's internet revolution. The drivers of this revolution were complete outsiders, not the large companies, not business people, not MBAs, but rather sort of entrepreneurs, really young people in dorm rooms, coming from weird places and weird backgrounds. And they have created sort of like multi-billion-dollar companies that maybe by now are taken over by professionals and professional managers. Another very important analogy is that content is not king. And what do I mean by that is that one of the striking things in media is that people are willing to contribute content for free in unlimited amounts. And that has been the case in the broadcasting revolution, where people would just put up music, their own lectures, and all kinds of content on radio. Similarly, as people do put up tremendous amount of content on social media or on the web. The key thing in terms of business innovation, which is of course an interesting question as to like how do you take advantage of this interactive medium, the key question is how do you build a business that allows consumers to access to good content? So in fact, business innovation in media has always been around finding a way to make money, and in the process create quality content that consumers really want. In both cases, we have seen overinvestment. There was a financial bubble in the 1920s. Obviously, 1929 was the biggest stock market crash, and I think media has contributed quite a bit to that. And also we had several internet bubbles popping, at the end of the 90s. And many people say that maybe there is a bit of an overheating going on the technology front today. A huge issue was patent wars and corporate rivalry, large corporations trying to grab sort of the benefits of the new environment and sort of getting at each other. Regulatory challenges, we have talked about these in the past. There were many. There are a lot today. Think about net neutrality, privacy, and all these other issues. And then finally, as I said, at the end of about 20 years, 2 decades, there is generally, the dust settles down, and we are finding ourselves for the next couple of decades with a dominant interface, both physical interface and applications, and with a bunch of large companies that are, chances are will be around for the next couple of decades, maybe even 100 years. This has been the case in the case of broadcasting. If you think about NBC, ABC, CBS, that were all created in the 1930s, at the beginning of radio, they all transitioned into television. And they are still very, very large companies today, having major roles in reaching consumers and providing content to consumers. But similarly, in the last 2 decades, enormous companies have emerged. Think about Facebook, Google, Apple. All of these could be argued are media companies. In many ways, they are living out of selling content, getting consumers having access to content for a fee or for advertising revenues. And my argument is that these companies will stay here for a really, really long time. Now, again, so if we take this revolution as given, and this slide is trying to show that online consumption in many ways, in terms of time spent or in terms of advertising revenues, is taking over any other media sector, then the question is, what is the world going to look like in the next 20, 30, maybe even 50 years? Okay. A little bit of a hint. One of the things I argue for is that there's going to be a dominant physical interface. I will break you the news that it is going to be something like the smartphone. People are talking about a lot of innovations going on in this space, from wearables to VR and AR and whatnot. I would like to argue that the smartphone is an incredibly successful product. Just as television was an incredibly successful product that hasn't changed really over 50 years. It remained the same core product in terms of people looking at a screen. Sure, there was a lot of innovation from black and white to color, from switching buttons and having a remote control and those kind of things. But the basic interface ended up being a large screen in front of which you are passively sitting and watching content. Well, similarly, I really believe that the smartphone is a product that is really the sweet spot that kind of integrates the possibilities that this technology allows you to do, namely interactivity, and your biology, your capacity to sort of like consume this content. It turns out that the smartphone is great because it is an extension of your body. You can, you play with it. It's always on you. You are kind of getting stressed if it's not in your pocket or if you lost it. But at the same time, you can put it away. And so this is the ideal compromise. And if you think about all the innovation that has been around finding other devices to interact with the internet, they have all failed, and they have failed for a good reason, because they may not be on the sweet spot of this compromise. So I really believe that the smartphone is going to be around for a very, very long time. There are going to be a bunch of infrastructure firms that will be doing great, that are producing these interfaces, that are providing the background infrastructure for us to access this enormous amount of content that the internet allows you to have. Comcast is one of them. But there is a bunch of other cable providers in the United States and everywhere else. So those people own the pipes for the data traffic. And then a bunch of content platforms, Google and Facebook in particular, that are probably the largest media companies in the history of mankind. They are, one unique thing about them is that they are not national companies, but they are international companies. They are dominating the entire planet rather than a large country, such as some of the old media companies. Now, of course, you will come at me and you will say, well, will innovation stop? And this is not what I'm saying. There is going to be a lot of innovation. There is going to be innovation around VR, wearables, and those kind of things. Just as there was innovation in the last 100 years in the context of broadcasting. Think about video games, think about cable networks, and so forth. So innovation is not going to stop, but the mainstream media consumption, the vast majority of content is going to be consumed in a very established and stable way, in my mind. And around that, there is going to be niche technologies, many, many niche technologies that will take advantage of interactivity for very small groups of consumers who are very devoted to these consumption patterns. You will also tell me, well, surely enough, this revolution, even if it's a revolution, might be somewhat different from what was the case in 100 years ago with broadcasting. And again, I think you would be right. Sure enough, this time it is different. I think the major difference is that today's media environment is extremely international. You know, like if you look at media consumption, whether it's content or habits or whatnot, it's a very local business. You know, music, for example, like there are a bunch of international hits, but the vast majority of music consumption is very local, just because of the language part. Well, this might be changing, and in fact, it is changing. If you think about these large media platforms, they are typically international companies, large, very large international organizations. Think about Facebook with 2 billion subscribers, you know, pretty much dominating every planet. And then, of course, you might also worry about the fact that this new medium is going to be changing, providing new challenges for us. Like, you know, there has been a lot of things about privacy, the fake news issue that has come out in the last US elections. Now, here, I think that, you know, people are overreacting a little bit. If you look at the history of media, broadcasting medium in particular, you find that many of the same issues, you know, popped up when broadcasting came about. For example, there was television debates about US presidents on television, and for the first time, and the public was completely outraged that now, you know, your capacity to seduce the audience as an actor are going to be more important than the content that a politician is trying to convey to the public, which is, you know, like much more thorough in a written format. There was all kinds of controversies. People were really forecasting that the new media is going to be destroying our political environment and our privacy or way of living. I think all of these are a little bit overblown, and I think that the industry will take care of them. There's great incentives to do so. So this is really the gist of what I wanted to talk about. Basically convey this idea that we should kind of get used to a world that is a little bit more stable than what it was in the last 20 years. And this is kind of good news because it means that we can adapt our businesses to this new world if we analyze its details. I have a bunch of slides here to illustrate these points, and I don't necessarily want to go through them one by one. This is showing how the smartphone has been the single most successful consumer good in the history of mankind. This is another slide that shows, you know, the most valuable media companies in terms of revenues. This is 2014. If you look at 2016, so just 2 years later, you can see how it has changed. Now it's changed the numbers have changed quite significantly, about 30% in 2 years for every company, but in particular for Comcast, that is sort of like controlling in many ways the amount of traffic. Most of this revenue is coming from charging for the pipes that people are using. Who captures the digital ad revenues that are sort of taking over all ad revenues? It's basically two large companies, Facebook and Google, around the world. And actually, this is how it looked in 2015. This is how it looks today. And maybe you cannot read it, but the idea is that they are capturing an increasing proportion of the total revenue. So it's not that competitors are coming in and they are, you know, taking them out. It's rather the opposite, is that they are taking an increasing share of those revenues. And of course, a couple of other things happening in the background. So these are some of the Google data centers. It's really important to appreciate the physical infrastructure that this company is building around the world. So each one of these data centers are quite enormous and quite spectacular. And they have about 50 around the world. This map shows you, you know, like how many of these are being built. So they are essentially building a giant brain. And again, you know, like this is just to drive home the point that it's very difficult to replicate this infrastructure. So that is one of the reasons why some of these media companies will be so dominant for the next couple of years, because they have tremendous scale economies that are very difficult to copy for people. This is the list, the number of subscribers for the different social networks, you know, like messaging services and social networks around the world. And you can see how Facebook is large. But actually, if you consider the fact that Facebook actually owns the second, the third largest social network, and also Instagram, then you really can truly appreciate how concentrated this industry is, how much bigger they are than anybody else. So when people are, saying that Facebook is being left by teenagers who are kind of more excited about the new innovation, which is, I think, Snapchat, no way. Basically, Facebook, every teenager is still on Facebook, and if it's not Facebook, they are on Instagram. And Snapchat has very little chance of taking over this large behemoth that dominates so much of the advertising revenues. This is Facebook in 2013. This is how Facebook looks in 2016. Other than a couple of dictatorships where the government is protecting a bunch of large industries, they basically dominate the world. So let me stop here for questions. Again, innovation will not stop. Don't be worried about that, but it is not necessarily going to have such a huge impact on the mainstream. The major difference compared to the last time is that the new media landscape is going to be much more international, and I think that creates a lot of challenges for firms, adapting to this new environment, but also for governments to regulate it. And don't be too worried about the alarming news, sort of like forecasting that the new media environment is going to be dangerous for people. I think that the industry will take care of itself, together with governments, of course. And let me stop here and allow you to ask a couple of questions.
All right, just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. All right, so first off, we have a question from Nitika saying, pace of change is much faster now than earlier. Do you think this revolution will last 100 years, or will it be short-lived compared to earlier times, and some other revolution will come faster?
I don't think it is faster, actually. I don't think it is faster. If you study the history of radio, it was an amazing revolution. It came incredibly fast, and it was incredibly violent to the times of the day. How could I illustrate this to you? Actually, I have a bunch of slides that will speak to this. So let me jump ahead a little bit. Let me jump ahead a bit. So here is a slide that kind of speaks to this. So at the time, in 1922, if you were reading about the radio revolution, because broadcasting started with radio, just to think about the internet, it didn't start with Facebook and Google. It started with Yahoo, and it started with Netscape and all these kind of like proto-internet companies that have all disappeared now. And similarly, in the 1920s, radio came about, but eventually it was television that ended up dominating the broadcasting medium. In the 1920s, people were talking about the euphoria of 1922. There was a total fascination of the public by radio. People would buy radio at some incredible rates. So think about 748 manufacturers. There existed 748 manufacturers of radio equipment in 1926. And all of them went bankrupt. Only a tenth of them, a year later, only 1/10 of them survived. This is very similar to the proportions that you see in the innovation cycles in Silicon Valley today. You had a very, very dynamic industry. There were 3,000 broadcast stations sold by 1922. There were about 2 million broadcast-capable stations in 1924, 2 years later. So this is an explosive change that, by the standards of the time, are very, very comparable to today. So I don't think that it's really true that today's innovation cycle is faster.
Okay, we have another question here. How do you see this new media environment affecting how people get their news? And how should public relations professionals adjust their approach to leverage these platforms rather than relying on traditional news media?
So I have very strong views on this. I'm doing quite a bit of research on news consumption. And my forecast is that people pretty much will be using Facebook to access news. It may not be completely the case today, but if you talk to publishers, pretty much all publishers have to be on Facebook. I mean, they don't want to be because the advertising revenues don't look that great, But in any case, advertising revenues don't look that great on the internet. And there is a shift back towards subscription systems. And on Facebook, you can actually reach a lot of consumers and get them to subscribe to your content. So, but I really think it is going to be very much on Facebook. And it's going to be difficult. There is going to be a shakeout, as it has been the case in the last 20 years. The newspaper industry and the news industry in general is probably the one that has been hurt most by interactivity. I think the pain is not over, but it's settling down. I mean, given how much time people are spending on social media, my forecast is that it is going to be pretty much on social media. I'll give you a very good example. I am an avid reader of The Economist, which is a subscription magazine. I have started it 15 years ago. I only use the newspaper. Then I shifted to their app. And now I am getting served the Economist articles on Facebook. Of course, there is a paywall, so they're still making money on me. And what I've discovered is that I basically read 70% of it on Facebook by the time I get to the app to kind of finish off the weekly magazine. So just because Facebook is monopolizing so much of our time, social media is monopolizing so much of our time, I think eventually news will have to migrate to social media as well.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question here. A few people are asking about your views on the future of advertising, and as far as text, audio, or video, what do you think will be the mixture, or will anyone be more prevalent than the others?
So, I mean, clearly video is doing great and is becoming more and more dominant. Of course, with video, you can transfer much more information to people. In particular, when you think about brand advertising, which is usually where the big bucks are. When you're building a brand, you're kind of investing in this equity. It is the same case in the case of television. You know, like a TV ad would be much more expensive than a newspaper ad usually. So I think that video is going to be the winner in terms of format. In terms of technology, we have an incredible infrastructure built to serve advertising to the right people. Pretty much all advertising, in my mind, is going to be migrating to programmatic advertising, meaning that machines will be deciding who should be served the ad, for how long, which ad, this and that. This is the case of Google. This is the case pretty much of most internet advertising. If you think about Facebook that captures 30% of the total digital advertising revenues, they also have algorithms driving this process and not people buying and selling advertising as it used to be in the past. So my forecast is that on the back end, there is going to be an incredible programmatic infrastructure. And on the front end, it's going to be contextual advertising relevant to you, mostly video and rarely any text.
All right, I think we have time for just one more question here. This one is from Dan Stoller, who asks, will there be a backlash against automation and recommendation algorithms and platforms? Why or why not?
That's an interesting question. Platforms are producing so much value in my mind. So if you think about Google, the fact that you have instant and unlimited access to all the knowledge of the world at your fingertips, no matter where you are on the planet, that is such an incredible amount of value created that even if there is going to be backlash, there is a constant backlash against the lack of privacy. People are freaked out by the fact that they send an email and they are getting advertising that relates to the words that they have used in that email. At the same time, they're going to have a real hard time giving up the benefits that these platforms are producing. For all their sort of mistakes and wrongs, these platforms are creating so much value to consumers that I have a real hard time to believe that there is going to be that this backlash is going to gain momentum to the level where this industry is going to get really hurt.
All right, well, I think that's all the time we have. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a special thanks to Professor Sarvary for sharing his views with us. Just one more reminder that there will be a recording of the webinar sent out after the session is ended. So we look forward to seeing you all again back here in the future. Thanks so much.